It wasn't always like this. All right, how did we get here? And the first of these canals, the oldest of them, is the Erie. That leads us to a few important questions to understand American history. Primarily, why was the Erie Canal built? And how? Oops. Did I already skip that last one? Yes. How did it come to be built? Not just how did it physically get built, but how did New York specifically agree to build this thing? Well, there's some important context here. Here we see the East Coast of America. If you were at my last talk, you've already, I think, seen this map, know where I'm headed. Actually, no, we looked at a different map with topographic features, but the story is always the same. There is this really great gap in the Appalachian Mountains here in upstate New York. The Mohawk River Valley, only point between Georgia and Maine, under 500 feet in elevation. It was a natural transportation route, and it has been for over 10,000 years about. The Haudenosaunee originally lived in upstate New York, used the Mohawk River extensively for trade, transportation, and similarly, as European settlers start moving in, they too begin using the Mohawk River Valley because it is such a natural transportation route. All right, let's look a little bit closer at that route though. So here we see upstate New York and its waterways around the time of the American Revolution. So you can easily head up the Hudson River in a boat. So this is prior to the steam engine. The easiest way to move anything is by water for the most part. There's a 2-foot difference between New York City and Albany. So that's a pretty gentle slope, really. You can easily take a large ship all the way up to Albany. However, there's a giant set of waterfalls right about here at Cohoes. So you have to carry all of your goods. Let's say you're trying to get to the Great Lakes. You can imagine this process in the opposite direction, coming from the Great Lakes. So you're going to go overland from Albany to Schenectady. Schenectady exists mainly as the first navigable port on the Mohawk River. Then you head up the Mohawk, and there's a number of waterfalls and rapids at which different towns generally spring up. And the reason the towns spring up there is because they have to service you as you have to get out of the water, carry your boat and everything within it around whatever that obstacle is, generally rapids or small waterfalls. And you would take Mohawk River all the way to where the Mohawk starts to turn north into its kind of headwaters in the Adirondacks around what is today Rome, New York. Then you take your boat on what's called the Great Carry. That's about a mile to sometimes, in drier weather, 3-mile long portage from the Mohawk River, this tiny stream, Wood Creek, which from all accounts I've gotten, Wood Creek, like, barely even deserves that name. It's this little stream. However, if you can get your boat onto Wood Creek and down it, you're in Oneida Lake, and then you can hook up to the Oneida River, either go up the Oswego River or down the Seneca River to the Finger Lakes. So that's what the interior natural water routes of New York look like and how you can traverse them. Also, if you get onto Lake Ontario, that's not the last time you got to get out of your boat, though. Anyone know the other time to get to the rest of the Great Lakes? Niagara Falls, exactly. So it is not smooth sailing from there. Similarly, the St. Lawrence River, if you go north, has a lot of issues as well. But still, it's a pretty decent water route, especially in comparison to anything else you've got to get into the interior of the country. So the first European, really, who sometimes called the grandfather of the Erie Canal, to recognize the importance of this route and the fact that in order to further develop the interior of the country, that route needed to be improved, was this man, Cadwallader Colden, a Scottish kind of Enlightenment thinker who ends up becoming, in the 1720s, he's appointed Surveyor General of the colony of New York. So he moves over here to New York. And shortly after his arrival, they send him out to explore this new, relatively new colony that England has. It's relatively unexplored. Sound out who lives in this territory that England is now claiming. So New York, kind of the original royal charter, as these things usually went, they were told, like, you go all the way until the Pacific Ocean. That's England's, right? Cadwallader Colden didn't make it that far. He made it to about Lake Michigan, it's believed. As far as it looked ocean-ish, I guess. Yeah, but he surveys the area, takes stock in the 1720s. Now, remember, at this point in time, forgot to add that part. So 1724, he's doing this. At this point in time, France still owns what is now Canada. And England and France, they're in this long rivalry that's going to last pretty much all the way till the end of the Napoleonic Wars. They're in this rivalry, competing to become the predominant colonial empire. And when he comes back to New York City, he writes a report describing everything. And he says that in order to compete with the French in the fur trade, which is the biggest industry at the time, they need to improve the internal navigation of the interior of New York. So what exactly does that mean? He's a little sketchy on the details. He is not proposing something like the Erie Canal. That would be ludicrous at the time. That would be like if I said right now, we should build like a high-speed rail from like Cody, Wyoming to somewhere in like South Dakota, right? Doesn't really make sense. But he is saying they should build some small canals, maybe, and improvements to get around some of the bigger obstacles, like maybe a 1 to 2 mile long canal connecting Wood Creek to the Mohawk River, a small canal around Little Falls, that sort of thing. But this being kind of this backwater colony of England, they don't really pay much attention to that, and he is promptly ignored in the suggestion. However, he is proven correct. The French do, for the next about 50 years, dominate the fur trade of the Great Lakes Basin. But then England wins the 7 Years' War and take over Canada, so it doesn't matter anymore. But then things start to change because a few years later, America gains its independence. And now the new American nation is really hoping to expand into the interior, something the British weren't all that concerned with. And we start to see some early movements towards a canal. And it really begins as the revolution's winding up. So for the last several years of the revolution, George Washington and his armies hanging out in the Hudson, waiting to see if the British are going to leave their one last stronghold, New York City. It's a pretty boring time, other than, fending off one mutiny and declining being named King of America. George Washington doesn't have a ton to do. So at one point, he goes and explores upstate New York, looking specifically at its waterways. And he's actually pretty impressed at that time. He, in fact, quickly writes a letter off to his fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, saying, hey, we really need to get working on improving the Potomac River's waterways so these New Yorkers don't outcompete Virginia. Spoiler alert, that rivalry is going to come up a lot throughout this. But so he sees kind of how great the natural waterways and geography of New York would be to building some sort of transportation improvement for its waterways. And right after the end of the war, we see the first kind of movement. On November 3rd, 1784, an Irish immigrant by the name of Christopher Cowles proposes a new plan to improve the waterways, to really examine improving the Mohawk River Valley. And the next year, in 1785, the New York legislature even approves a supply bill, giving him a couple $1,000s to survey the Mohawk River and come up with a plan. Now, this is an important thing to remember. Nowadays, a lot of times when we hear like literally any amount of money from back in the 1700s, we're like, must have been a fortune, right? Not really. A couple $1,000s back then is maybe like $50,000 today. And, you know, that's not money to sneeze at, but imagine hiring a surveyor now to survey about 100 miles. They're charging a lot more than $50,000 to do that, right? So Coles kind of runs out of money. Coles has a famous quote. He was always ahead of his time, really. He devised this really ingenious way to get water to New York City, was kind of his most notable kind of failed invention. And he said, if I had been born a hatter, men would have been born without heads. So yeah, Coles' plan fails there. But in 1885, we also see the entrance of this man to the story. This is Elkanah Watson. He's a unique character. Seems to be a bit of like a rake, if you will. He's good friends with Benjamin Franklin. He's really involved in Masonic circles during the Revolution, which means he's connected with like all the movers and shakers of the Revolutionary era. He actually brings messages between the Continental Congress and Ben Franklin, who's negotiating with France at the time. So he knows everybody kind of in the Revolutionary War circle. So this is also the time when you could stop in. Oh, I skipped ahead a bit. Stop in at the house of the most important man in the country and just kind of unannounced and have dinner with him, which he does in 1785. Elkanah Watson was traveling around, came to Mount Vernon, had stayed for like 2 days with George Washington. Apparently he wildly annoyed George Washington while he was there. But nonetheless, George Washington was, I guess, a good host and kind of discussed with Watson one of their mutual interests, which were what they called at the time internal improvements. Those are what we would today call infrastructure projects, especially kind of these waterway internal improvements. Talking about Washington, he's trying to build a canal along the Potomac, and perhaps they also discussed these waterways that Washington had seen in New York in 1783. Watson is, so the source of this is for the most part Elkanah Watson, and he is an unreliable narrator at best. He will spend almost all of his life trying to take sole credit for coming up with the Erie Canal, and will not let anyone forget about it. But anyway, he moves to Albany a few years after this conversation. His business in North Carolina had failed, and he knows about the natural route of the Mohawk Valley. And March 24th, 1791, he gets the state to authorize a survey of the Mohawk River, which is important. Again, remember, Watson is this very connected Revolutionary War era figure. So he's able to convince people in the state legislature. And we're going to see one of his most important allies in this next. Because they survey in 1791 find, yeah, there's a lot of potential here for a possible set of canals improvements on the Mohawk River. So we enter the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Corporation, founded in 92, excuse me. Early in the year, after the report of that first survey comes back in, Watson is one of the co-founders, along the gentleman by the name of Philip Schuyler. We have any Hamilton fans in here? You might recognize him. Father-in-law to Alexander Hamilton, noted Revolutionary War general and landholder in New York. At the time, incredibly wealthy. They form a joint stock corporation, getting kind of all the most prominent families in New York to put money into this idea that they're going to build some small canals and locks around some of the bigger obstacles in the Mohawk River Valley. The first engineer for this project is Philip Schuyler, because he has the giant experience of having seen a canal before, which is more than most Americans can say. We've been to England once or twice. Let's see, you're returning from my last talk where I already made that joke. So, but anyway, he doesn't work too well. Well, he does. They build a small canal connecting Rome and the Mohawk River to Wood Creek. They build a set of canals or locks around Little Falls and a small canal. But yeah, after the Little Falls, Philip Schuyler realizes he's a bit outside of his depth, so they hire William Weston to become the chief engineer. He's a British engineer, comes over to America, consults on almost every major waterway project. I need to fix this slide in the future so you can read it. But they're never able to overcome these, the Great Falls at Cohoes on the river. And really, they're never going to really be able to overcome the Mohawk River in general. A lot of these improvements that Weston builds get washed away. Those early locks they built were made out of wood, which rot very quickly. Wood and water do not mix well, especially if there isn't water involved all the time. So yeah, these lock gates, they rot out. The water washes everything away, and a lot of these investors, I still can't fully wrap my head around it. You would kind of, if you invest in a company, you kind of made an IOU to the company. You didn't actually give them any money. So then the company would later have to beg you to finally, live up to your promise that you'd pay them. And then when the Western Inland isn't doing well financially, investors are then like, well, I'm not going to give you money. I'm just going to sink it into this useless project. So they're always short on funds, which is a crucial kind of mistake in the Western Inland Lock and Navigation's failure. That they never have this funding, in part because they are a privately owned corporation. It's one of the big lessons they will take away. Also, that kind of these foreign engineers aren't really worth the massive expense, and that they can't just improve the Mohawk River. The Mohawk is too difficult of a waterway to just build a couple locks around. So that's New York as we get to about the turn of the 19th century, the 1800s. But let's look at the larger context of America at the time. 1801, the Louisiana Purchase happens. So we've got increased demand to start moving westward by these Euro-American settlers. They want to start, we get Kentucky becomes the first state off the East Coast in the 1790s. Tennessee joins a little bit later. There's the whole Northwest Territory up there with the great transportation route that is the Great Lakes. You've got the Mississippi River, etc. American settlers want to get out there, use this land. We're seeing at this time as well a loss of trade to Canada. Those Great Lakes, which are great for transportation, we've gone over this difficult route through New York, which is still the best route from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. If you're going through the United States, often just takes the much easier route of go up the St. Lawrence. You've only got to take your boat out of the water once or twice there, and it's a much bigger river. So that's an issue. We're being outcompeted there. There's a growing, as a result, east-west divide in the country. The Appalachians are sort of tearing the country in half because all the trade on the East Coast, that's all going to the Atlantic Ocean, right? And then your trade is either going from the Great Lakes up the St. Lawrence or down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And these settlers moving west are wondering, why exactly do we need to be part of this United States of America? What are they doing for us economically, at least? And we see kind of these splinters in 1805 during what's called the Burr Conspiracy, which Central New Yorkers are involved in parts. Aaron Burr has this kind of, after he stops being vice president, has this kind of hazy plan to break off a part of Western America or maybe parts of Mexico to form his own empire. That's kind of scary to these folks planning what to do here in America. We've also got Jeffersonian democracy at the time. It's the era of Jefferson and his idyllic vision of these yeoman farmers. Every good American will have their own farm and stuff, and you can't do that on the East Coast. You need to get to these fertile lands in the interior, that sort of thing. So that's all part of it, and populism, and they're starting to try to give the common man, if you will, a vote and a say in how things are run. And finally, it's the Napoleonic Wars. So the rest of Europe is just being devastated by war. There is this real need for basic things like foodstuffs. If you're fighting a war, you can't harvest goods. Same thing if a giant battle is fought in your cornfield, you then can't harvest that corn generally. So America is sending all this stuff to England. It's estimated that in like the Peninsular Campaign, like almost all the Duke of Wellington's wheat comes from America. So America's making tons of money in tariffs at the time. So much money, they're actually running, what's the opposite of a deficit? Surplus, there we go. See, the government doesn't run those ever. But I can barely think of what that is. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so the government's running a surplus. It's crazy. So they're like, what do we do? So they've actually got all this extra money from tariffs. Jefferson has his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, draw up in 1807 what's called the Gallatin Plan, which we see here. Gallatin proposes that a federal system of internal improvements be made across the US with this surplus tariff money. So roads would be made, improvements to rivers, and you'll see here a couple of canals, actually 3 canals in New York, attaching all of the Great Lakes together. And, New York's like, great, we've kind of wanted to build something like this for about a decade at this point, right? Since the Western Inland started, even before that with calls. But they kept finding there was no money. But this seems to indicate that the federal government is willing to help pay for all or most of these internal improvements for New York. So this really gets the wheels spinning in upstate New York. And the big year is 1807. Kind of starts out with this man. This is Jesse Hawley. He is a grain merchant who sets up a grain mill at Seneca Falls. However, his business goes bankrupt in 1807, in part due to the enormous transportation costs of getting his ground wheat to market. Also, his partner runs away with half their money, which is not great. I believe that's the business parlance for that. So Jesse Hawley, his business is so bad, he has to go to jail for it, right? He goes to debtor's prison in Canandaigua. Which gives him a lot of extra time on his hands. And during that time, he studies the Gallatin Report, it's believed, other maps of upstate New York. If you were at the last talk, that map that I showed of early New York, it's believed it was probably that map by Simeon DeWitt. Studies that, sees this kind of natural geographic pattern here, and writes what are called the Hercules essays. These essays are originally published in the Genesee Messenger, and they call for a canal from Lake Erie to the Hudson River. He also writes as Hercules because he's afraid no one's going to listen to just a random guy in jail. So yeah, and Hercules dug a canal. That was one of his feats. So writes the Hercules essays. Those reach the hands of several influential figures in our series. Though the timeline on it's a bit hazy. There's this giant debate in the early canal world about whose idea the canal was. Nowadays, us canal historians sort of scoff at it. It's like, who cares? You all kind of contributed. No one person just had it emerge from their head. But Jesse Hawley, he's up there. But also almost simultaneously, upstate New York sees a lot of enthusiasm after the Gallatin Report for what's called a canal ticket. Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists put aside their differences in upstate New York and say, hey, we both need this canal. We will benefit tremendously from its construction. And that sweeps upstate New York in the state legislative chamber. And they take their seats in 1808. February 4th, 1808, Joshua Foreman rises in the state assembly. Joshua Foreman of Syracuse rises to propose a survey for a canal connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, seconded by Benjamin Wright of Rome, who had been William Weston's assistant, and will eventually become the head engineer on the Erie Canal. So they propose this, they debate it for a couple months, and $600 on April 11th is authorized for a survey. Going back to what I just said, that's not a lot of money, but luckily they find a guy by the name of James Geddes, who is willing to do a lot of pro bono work, and he's also from Syracuse. He's a salt boiler in Syracuse, so he sees the advantage of this. They also promise him, like, hey, once we get this canal built, Jimmy, we're gonna pay you for all that extra money that you kind of donate to the canal project. And he comes back with a pretty positive survey. There were some questions out around Rochester and the Irondequoit Valley, if a canal would be feasible there. Geddes comes back, says, like, yes, the necessary glacial ridges exist. It's big and dramatic, trust me. So the New York State Legislature, on reading Geddes's report, they send Joshua Foreman down to Washington, D.C. Gallatin reports just come out. Seems like the federal government's really into funding these transportation improvements. So he goes to Washington to meet with outgoing President Thomas Jefferson, who's a lame duck, so happy to sign any bill that comes on his desk, right? Well, he meets with Thomas Jefferson, who says this: a prime project might be executed a century hence. Why, sir, here's a canal of a few miles projected by General Washington. He's referring to the Potomac Canal around the Great Falls on the Potomac, which, if completed, would render this a fine commercial city, just languished for many years because of the small sum of $200,000 necessary to complete it. It cannot be obtained by the federal government, the state government, or from individuals. You talk of making a canal 350 miles through the wilderness. It's little short of madness to think of at this day. Not the only time Thomas Jefferson's been wrong, but he's definitely going to be wrong here. And as you can see, Thomas Jefferson says there's no way that you're going to get federal money for this. The Potomac Canal is this excellent example of why the Gallatin Report falls apart. Same with what's about to happen to the proposed bill that Foreman's trying to get passed. Sectional conflicts ruin any chance of federal funding for almost all major infrastructure projects. North Carolina, they're going to see a bill that they think is only going to benefit New York, so they're going to say no on that. Same thing, New York sees a bill that they think is going to just benefit like South Carolina or something, they're against it. Practically nothing gets federal funding at this time, except for one road through Virginia. That's what happens when you get the president for about like 50 years. So yeah, that goes nowhere in 1809. It's a big defeat for the canal. So that leads us to 1810. This is when things start to get real spicy. This guy right here is Jonas Platt. He's a state senator of the Plattsburgh Platts, if you will. So pretty prominent New Yorker. He is the Federalist challenger for the 1810 election. A Federalist, for context, has not won the gubernatorial race since the early 1790s in New York when John Jay did it. So Platt is a real long shot, especially since he is going to be running against the very popular Daniel D. Tompkins, namesake of Tompkins County, who is this popular Democratic Republican incumbent. So Jonas Platt is kind of flailing around, looking for some sort of gimmick that's going to help propel him to the governor's mansion. I assume they had a mansion still at that time. And he's approached by a fellow Federalist, a guy by the name of Thomas Eddy, who is the treasurer of the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company. It still exists at this time. It's kind of still hanging on to life. And Eddy's like, hey, they've got this cool canal idea. It could help me a bit too, because my attempt at canalizing upstate New York hasn't worked well. And on March 12th, they would approach an unlikely ally together after they agree that a canal plan could be the ticket to get them into the governor's office. But they know that they're Federalists, something we can't identify with now. Very partisan time. People were really split. And if someone from the other party suggested something, you wouldn't go for it. They said, let's get somebody from the other party to, agree with this plan. So they seek out DeWitt Clinton. Right. Yeah. So who is DeWitt Clinton? Just some quick biographical stuff on him, because he's obviously going to be important going forward in this story, in what's sometimes known as Clinton's Ditch. Born March 2nd, 1769, into the powerful Clinton family. His father, James, is a Revolutionary War general. He is the Clinton in the Sullivan-Clinton campaign, the kind of genocidal campaign against the Haudenosaunee through the Finger Lakes. And his uncle is George Clinton, not the lead singer of Parliament Funkadelic, but the first governor of New York, who is governor pretty much until he becomes vice president under Thomas Jefferson, and he remains that until he dies. So George Clinton's really influential, and DeWitt Clinton starts out as a secretary for his uncle before being elected to the state legislature in 1798. He even ends up being the United States Senator for New York for a year, though he by all accounts, kind of hated Washington, D.C., which is odd because he would, for the rest of his life, try to get back there, but as president this time. But anyway, he serves as senator briefly. He's kind of most noted this time. He is the mayor of New York City. At the time, mayor of New York was an appointed position. The governor would appoint you mayor of New York. Easy to get appointed when your uncle's the governor too. He learns from his uncle, and he becomes one of the state's Democratic Republican kingmakers. There's a saying at the time that the Livingston, there were three big families in New York politics. The Livingstons had the people, the Schuylers had the money, and the Clintons had the power. So yeah, he's from the Clintons. So they get him on board. And on March 13th, 1810, Jonas Platt proposes in the state senate a resolution to explore routes between the Hudson and the Great Lakes. This idea is then seconded by DeWitt Clinton. When Clinton seconds it, gives the rest of the Democratic Republicans kind of the okay that they too can vote for this bill. And so the New York State Canal Commission is formed in 1810. It is a bipartisan committee composed of kind of the foremost New Yorkers at the time. Gouverneur Morris, Stephen Van Rensselaer, William North, Thomas Eddy, DeWitt Clinton, Simeon DeWitt, and Peter Buell Porter. This is sort of the who's who of New York politics. We've got at least three New York State senators, one future Secretary of War on there, one guy who wrote the Constitution, literally, he's also a senator. But so they're all there and they're given the task of seeing if a canal is practical. And on July 2nd, 1810, they set out on this grand tour of upstate New York, exploring everything. Most of them take a boat. There's this famous folktale, sort of, that they avoid getting malaria in the Montezuma swamps because of this thick haze of cigar smoke that surrounds them at practically all times. And they go out, explore upstate New York, and come back in 1811 to start writing up their report to give to the next session of the state legislature. Gouverneur Morris, who is the president of the commission, he is selected to write the first report, which is going to be submitted March 2nd. Morris is a natural choice, Revolutionary War figure. He wrote the preamble to the Constitution. So if you got a guy like that on your team, he's always the designated writer. And they recommend a route to Lake Erie. There's this big debate on whether to go to Lake Ontario, which is much closer, or all the way to Lake Erie. However, Morris crucially includes one detail that in this first report that will haunt the Canal Commission for the next almost decade, which is he recommends an inclined plane. So just an unbroken canal, no locks, from Buffalo to Schenectady. So just sort of a giant ramp, if you will. Sounds good in theory. You're only going to need to get water from one place, Lake Erie, the highest point. Won't have to stop for locks. However, there are a number of impracticalities to this idea, notably over the think Schoharie Creek, you would need a giant embankment about 300 feet high. Just these crazy sort of engineering difficulties you would have. And this will be attacked for a while. But anyway, it's a favorable enough report that on April 8th, an act is made allowing the canal commissioners to seek funding from the federal government, preferably for a canal. Also, Robert Livingston and Robert Fulton are appointed commissioners. Also in April, DeWitt Clinton is made the lieutenant governor, so he has a bit more sway as well now. That summer, they bring back James Geddes and Benjamin Wright to survey this route again. And they come back and say, hey, everyone, that whole inclined plane thing's not going to work. We need to have locks. Governor Morris reportedly is really resistant to this, but eventually relents and kind of changes his mind, agrees that they can build a locked canal. On December 21st, Clinton and Morris head down to Washington, D.C. A year ago or so, I read Governor Morris's diaries about most of this. It's very interesting. Supposedly, they turned a lot of people off from their plan because it seemed like DeWitt Clinton was just maneuvering himself to become the next president, which made people a little upset. But anyway, they head down to meet with James Madison, who on Christmas Eve delivered a favorable speech to Congress saying like, hey, yeah, we need federal funding for these internal improvements. Though he does mention you might need a constitutional amendment to allow the federal government to pay for just single state transportation things. However, that kind of appeal falls on deaf ears. On January 10th, 1812, Congress rejects the land grant bill that would have funded a canal. Then the War of 1812 happens, which kind of interrupts everything for a canal. The war effort itself, upstate New York, is a major front in that war. And it is hindered a lot of times by the poor transportation network. The Army can't communicate, can't supply its soldiers particularly well. So we get giant sort of debacles like what happens at the Battle of Queenston Heights, which is an American defeat on the Niagara River. So they're hindered by that. Also in 1812, DeWitt Clinton runs for president on a peace ticket. He sort of betrays the Democratic Republican Party to seek Federalist support. But he loses by Pennsylvania. That's the only state that really separates the Electoral College in the end. So that really hurts DeWitt Clinton's political career. And then Daniel Tompkins on April 15th, 1814, rescinds the Canal Act. Canal is put on hiatus. Daniel D. Tompkins is a noted canal hater. He's this big, he becomes really popular during the war. He's really a war governor. He's always looking for a fight with England, which is going to be important throughout the rest of our tale here as well. And now, because of DeWitt Clinton's run for president as a Federalist, Tompkins isn't supporting him anymore. He loses that mayoral appointment in New York City. So that's the end of DeWitt Clinton's career, seemingly. But there's hope. So the only time the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company ever runs a profit is during the War of 1812, because they're able to gouge the army horribly as it tries to move things like cannons to the front. And the end of the war, because we didn't completely lose to England, sparks this big wave of patriotic and nationalistic support. So Americans are jazzed up. We can do anything now, right? We've beat England twice. Who knows? We could build a canal too, and let's show the world what a democracy can do. That sort of thing. Sparks what's called the era of good feelings. And after the war, despite what looked like all these setbacks to the canal, its prospects start to revive. Clinton gets convinced by Thomas Eddy and others it's time for him to emerge from his kind of political wilderness. And July 15th, he reemerges with a speaking tour across New York, calling for a canal that culminates December 3rd, 1815, with a speech at the City Hotel. It's really stage managed. This like 30-page petition is magically written by the crowd that everybody unanimously signs. It's incredible how those things happen. The same petition gets sent all over the state, and it starts flooding the state house in Albany. So in 1816, there's this big swell in support for the canal, so much so the state legislature can't ignore it. Daniel D. Tompkins, however, does not like Daniel D. Tompkins does not like the idea of the canal, as I've said, and also emerging is this young up-and-coming New York State politician in the state Senate, Martin Van Buren, who Van Buren's a fascinating character. He's one of the greatest politicians in American history, just bent on gaining power throughout most of his life. And he sees DeWitt Clinton as really his biggest rival in the Democratic Republican Party. So he helps Tompkins kind of make a toothless 1816 act. It really only authorizes a couple more surveys, and they've surveyed the Mohawk River to death at this point. They know, yes, a canal is possible. Van Buren's kind of hoping, like, maybe, enthusiasm for this canal will wane. However, 1817 happens. There's still a lot of support for a canal. Then on February 24th, Daniel D. Tompkins is appointed vice president for James Monroe. So he stops being governor. So there goes one of the canal's biggest detractors in the state. He's now headed to Washington. And as Hamilton, the musical, implies, that's not a real job. So his power is kind of taken away. Then on March 3rd, the last thing James Monroe does in office is veto the bonus bill, a bill that had been proposed by a young John C. Calhoun that would have funded essentially the Gallatin Plan, gets vetoed by Madison, who says they need a constitutional amendment. He might also be worried that Virginia is going to lose its prominence, but that's just speculation. It's totally constitutional scruples. Anyway, but then March 19th, after the bill is vetoed, New York State realizes they're never getting federal funding for this. They're never going to be able to make it go through. So March 19th, a new bill is written to finance a canal between Rome and the Seneca River. On April 10th, the bill passes the Assembly. But there's two houses to the New York State Legislature, and it finally gets read to the Senate on April 14th, 1817, the day before the New York State Legislature is set to adjourn. And then all the bills that they've proposed, if they're not passed, you got to do it all over again in the next session. So it gets read to the Senate. Senate has to, read it over and stuff. And they come back on the 15th of April, 10 a.m. The Senate returns an amended bill to the Assembly. The Assembly reads it, and they say, okay, looks good to us. But it gets sent back to the Senate. I don't really know how government works fully. Yeah, exactly. There's legal stuff. So the Assembly reads it. They're like, okay, send it back to the Senate. The Senate reads it. And then all of a sudden, they start having scruples. Josiah Ogden rises and suggests sending the bill to committee. a committee has never done anything in a speedy fashion, right? So everyone realizes that's an attempt to just kill the bill outright. But he is handily defeated and kind of shouted down in the state Senate. The Senate had made a few amendments, or the Assembly made some amendments, and the Senate approved those amendments and sent it back to the Assembly to kind of rubber stamp it, seemingly. However, the Assembly says, actually, you know what? We do not want to buy out the Western Inland Lock and Navigation Company. It's one of the various things. So they say, get rid of this amendment to the bill and send it back to the Senate. Now, the Senate was already close. The Western Inland's got a bunch of friends. It's the giant corporation. It has friends in Albany, right? But then dramatically, Martin Van Buren rises from his seat and delivers an impassioned pro-canal speech. He's changed his stance on the canal, and that lets his kind of faction in the state Senate carte blanche to vote their conscience on the canal. So now Van Buren gets to present himself as a savior to the canal. A vote's quickly called after that, and the bill passes the Senate 13-12. I didn't get to do my suspense thing. It should be noted in both the Assembly and the Senate, no delegates from Westchester County, any of New York City or Long Island will vote in favor of the canal, despite the fact New York City will grow the most of any of the places impacted by the canal. But the bill has now passed the Senate and the Assembly, right? Today, it would just go straight to the governor. We got 2 houses. However, at this point, prior to the 1821 Constitution, we had what was called the Council of Revision, a panel of 4 men. Jonas Platt and Joseph Yates. You know Joseph Platt already, pro-canal, but also Judge James Kent and Smith Thompson, both believed to be anti-canal. Now that looks like it would be a tie, right? And it would be. Then the deciding vote would be Daniel D. Tompkins' protege, the acting governor at the time, John Taylor. Now, if you're Daniel D. Tompkins' protege, you're probably going to be anti-canal, right? Right. So it looks like the canal is going to be defeated. However, one of the worst moments of vice presidential overreach in history, ex-governor, now Vice President Tompkins, he hasn't left Albany yet, enters the room that the Council of Revision is meeting in and delivers an impassioned speech on why they should vote against the canal. Instead, they should fund military improvements to prepare for the next war with England, which he thinks is imminent any day now. However, he didn't think that through fully, because Judge Kent, his son, had died in the War of 1812, making him, here's James Kent, an ardent pacifist after that. And James Kent delivered what I think is one of the best sentiments ever delivered by an American politician, which is, if we are to have war or to have a canal, I am in favor of the canal and I vote for the bill. Thus, it passes 3-1 through the Council of Revision. John Taylor reluctantly signs the bill. He knows politically he couldn't, I mean, he's acting governor. You can't veto a bill that important. So the canal passes. In April, canal commissioners start making the first decisions on the canal, where they're going to build it, who they're going to get to build it. May 7th, James Geddes and Benjamin Wright are consulted and hired as some of the head engineers for this project. In May, DeWitt Clinton is elected governor. He defeats sort of Peter Buell Porter, a fellow canal commissioner, but he's just the last minute write-in candidate. It is the largest margin of victory a New York State gubernatorial candidate has ever won. He wins about 98% of the vote. Propelled by his success with the canal, on June 27th, the first canal contract is let to John Seymour. They tell him to hold off for a few days, because then on July 4th, 1817, Judge John Richardson will dig the first shovelful of the canal in Rome. The rest is history.